What did Jesus actually teach about the end times in the Olivet Discourse? It is important to ask this question because much of our answer depends on how we view these teachings in Matthew 24. Many people draw from Jesus' words that there will be a one-world dictator who will make a covenant with modern Israel as he sets up his image in a newly constructed temple in Jerusalem. But is this actually going to happen? And so this is the big question for us today. Will it happen? Or already happened? Before we go there, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it. You can also get a copy of my book, End Times Mission, which covers this topic and will answer all your eschatological questions. You can get it on Amazon Kindle and Audible, link in the description. Now back to Matthew 24. First, it's vital to understand how, from an Old Testament perspective, the coming of the Messiah and the ultimate desolation of adulterous Israel were a judgment from God and the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. Yet, before we proceed, I want to upgrade your understanding of the then coming events to which Jesus spoke in Matthew 24, as this passage is so often today seen as relating to unforeseen events in our time. You know, the things Jesus mentioned, like the gospel being preached everywhere, the many examples of modern false prophets, earthquakes, the nuclear age, etc. But let's start with the modern claim of many that the future Antichrist will make a covenant with the modern nation of Israel just before he sets up his image in the not yet rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. Maybe you've heard this before, or maybe you believe it. Either way, this idea comes from Matthew 24, 15 and 16. But let's take a look at the fuller passage where Jesus said, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." For most modern people, their minds naturally gravitate towards the terrible abomination of desolation, as Jesus points his readers back to the writing of Daniel several hundred years before. They associate those words with the setting up of an image in the temple during the last days of world history by the Antichrist. But this view is simply not accurate for several reasons. First and foremost, in the book of Daniel, from where Jesus drew his terminology, the abomination of desolation, this phrase does not point to an event that takes place several thousand years in the future. In one case, the phrase, which is used with regularity in Daniel's prophecies, clearly points to Antiochus Epiphanes of the Seleucid or Greek Empire, stopping the regular Jewish burnt offerings and sacrificing a pig. Yes, a pig, on the altar in Jerusalem in the 2nd century BC. In like manner, this term's usage in Daniel 9:27, to which Jesus was referring in Matthew 24:15, also clearly does not point to an event thousands of years later. Instead, the prophet Daniel was ominously predicting the destruction of the holy city by the Romans within a generation of those who would crucify the Messiah. Think about it for a moment. Does it really make sense that Jesus' reference of Daniel would point to anything other than the events which were relatively near on the historical stage? After all, what good would it have done those people to whom he was speaking, many of whom were seeing him for the last time before his death? Doesn't it just make more sense that he was giving them instructions that would directly help them in the days and years to come, as opposed to making a grocery list of super signs for a future generation that really wouldn't understand what he was talking about anyway? In terms of Jesus' citation from Daniel, it was Daniel himself who most clearly prophesied the destruction of the Jewish temple in the time immediately following the coming of the Messiah. About this, he very clearly says, "The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary." Keep in mind that these words were spoken during a time where the temple lay in ruins because of its destruction by the Babylonians. Therefore, Daniel had to be speaking about a future temple and, for him, a future destruction. This is a spot-on prediction of what happened in the first century when the Roman Emperor Vespasian sent his son Titus to finish the conquest of Israel that he, Vespasian, started as Nero's general a few years earlier. In other words, think of it like this. Titus, the son of the emperor, the prince of the Roman people, the people to come, from Daniel's perspective, overtook the city, Jerusalem, and destroyed the sanctuary, including all of the temple. It's in this context that Daniel utilizes the expression, the abomination of desolation. And that's why it seems much more reasonable to see Jesus' words to his hearers as a warning that within their lifetime, Jerusalem and Israel would be left in ruin. It's like he was saying to them, look, I'm not going to be with you much longer. And the things that were written about long ago are about to take place. So when you see the sign of Daniel spoken of, flee to the surrounding countryside. This makes much more sense. As far as the phrase, the abomination of desolation, we can be assured that the ancient readers would not have taken this only to refer to the setting up of a physical image in the holy place of the temple. After all, these things did take place both during the Roman siege and after it was destroyed when they set up a temple to Jupiter. Yet this abomination also refers to all of the things that would precede the temple's destruction, such as the assailing of the city of Jerusalem by foreign armies. Compare Jesus' words in Matthew 24, for example, with its parallel account in Luke. Keep in mind that Matthew, who seemingly wrote to a more specifically Jewish audience and possibly in Hebrew, had no need to explain his Daniel allusion. Thus he said, let the reader understand. Yet in Luke's account, maybe accommodating a broader audience, we see those same events explained this way. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. According to Luke's interpretation of Jesus' words, the abomination of desolation was the surrounding of Jerusalem by foreign armies. Did you catch it? As we compare Scripture with Scripture, it is clear what Jesus meant when he referenced Daniel. What did Jesus mean by the abomination that makes desolate? Answer, the same thing that Daniel meant by it. He meant that when the people saw Jerusalem surrounded, the time of its desolation, the time of its destruction, was soon to follow. Like I said, the Roman armies made a sacrifice in the temple just before its destruction. We know this because Josephus, the first century historian and eyewitness to the siege of Jerusalem, testified that as the Romans burned down the temple and all of its adjacent buildings, they, quote, brought their ensigns to the temple and set them over against its eastern gate inside the temple, and there did they offer sacrifices to their gods. Now, an ensign is a military symbol, like a flag that goes before an army in battle. Like the modern American flag, the Roman ensign, or standard, was a pole with an eagle on top of it. For them, the eagle was a symbol of Roman power, and it was that standard that was set up in the Jewish temple just before its destruction. This little piece of information also makes sense of Jesus' obscure statement just a few verses later in Matthew 24:28, when he said, where the corpse or body is, there the vultures or eagles will gather. Keep in mind, the Greek word for vulture might also be translated as eagle. Jesus' statement then was reflective of the fact that he would be crucified at Jerusalem. Consequently, it was there that the Roman armies, led by their ensigns, would gather for a climactic battle with the Jewish people. This first century reference to an eagle acts as a very explicit implication of the Romans and their coming siege. My feelings are that a first century audience living in that place would have understood his words no other way. This just seems like the more likely explanation than the one we come up with when we futurize these verses. I think that in Matthew 24, Jesus was warning his sheep to heed his instruction that they not participate in the rebellion of the Jewish people against the Romans, which would incite their masters, the Romans, to destroy their homeland. In the process, upwards of 1 million Jews lost their lives or were led into captivity. In terms of population percentage, more Jews were killed in the Roman conquest of the first century than during the Holocaust. Crazy, right? Continuing, Jesus told believers to flee the city. Fortunately for his disciples, many of them had already been scattered abroad because of the tremendous persecution they faced at the hands of the Jews. Those events, highlighted in Acts 8:1, would have taken place just a few years before the Roman conquest. It is also evident from various ancient historical records that many people sought refuge in the surrounding mountains and countryside of Judea as the walls of Jerusalem were being assailed. The tribulation of those days was so great that thousands upon thousands either died of starvation or were slain either by the Romans or by the fighting Jewish factions. God finally put an end to the Jewish war with the defeat of the final holdouts at Herod's old fortress palace in Masada in 72. Was Jesus mistaken about future events? I don't think so. He was describing the terrible times that would come upon God's people and the holy city in the first century. Are you getting my point yet? Can you see how the things Jesus talked about in the Olivet Discourse were actually referring to the coming destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans? Please leave your thoughts in the comments. If you haven't already seen it, watch my video on how Jesus' cloud coming in Matthew 24 was actually an Old Testament style prophecy about his judgment on the city. I'll make sure to link that one in the description. So now, what do we make of all the other things Jesus mentioned in Matthew 24, such as astrological happenings, famines, wars, and false prophets? Did these things happen as well in that time? Yes, they did. But I'm going to save that topic for another video. Again, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, friends, as it really does help me to continue creating this kind of content. And with that, we'll dive deeper into Matthew 24 next time. Until then, and as always, it was great to gospel with you.